We have about a minute or a little less until we get going. So we still have a lot of people logging in, but we will start right on time. And we will try to end right on time as well to make sure we respect all of your time. All right, it looks like we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Adam Hill. I'm the Executive Vice President here at Scarborough. Scarborough is a group of 5 companies, and so this presentation is brought to you by this group as well as Scarborough University. Scarborough University is our attempt to make sure that we keep not only our internal staff informed and educated and trained on the new happenings within the world of customs and logistics, but also what we bring out to the trade as well to make sure that we offer these types of trainings as much as we can, because we feel like that an informed customer makes everyone's lives just a little bit easier. So with that as well today is Samuel Camarillo. Samuel is our Southern Border Manager. Samuel joined us about 6 months ago and has been a great addition to our team and has a lot of experience down on the southern border. He worked for Mexican Customs for a while. He's also a Mexican attorney. So he's going to also bring some very unique insight and experience into this discussion. We'll spend about the first 20 or so minutes kind of walking through our presentation. We'll spend a little bit of time on kind of the overall process. There are some detailed slides that you will see as well. Those are more for once this presentation gets sent out after the fact, that you guys can go ahead and use those and make sure that you can share them and things like that. But we won't spend a lot of time just reading through that slide, because we want to spend as much time as we can asking questions. This is one of our largest attended webinars to date. We already have probably 20 or so questions that have come in. Please keep sending them in. There's a question and answer piece that you can type your questions, and then we will do our very best to get to all of them as time permits. If for some reason we don't get to them, we do promise that we will get every question that does get asked. We will certainly answer it as well. So with that, we're going to start talking a little bit about the Mexican cross-border process. So we're going to talk about the easier of the two sides first. And the easier two sides is the northbound process, or which would be the export from Mexico and the import into the United States. This process is just a little bit simpler. Probably everybody on this call is a little bit more familiar with that process and kind of some of the rules and regulations, especially once we get into the U.S. side. But we're going to kind of walk you through this process. The screen you see here, if after this, if any of you would like some of these, we do have some of these printed out as well. You can send a note in and we can try to get some of these sent out to you as well. So obviously in the northbound process, there's a few points to note before we kind of talk about this. One is the fact that it is not uncommon to have 3 power units touch your cargo as it's trying to come northbound or southbound across the Mexican border. So that's why you see some of these steps. They may not make total sense, but if you keep that in the back of your mind the entire time, it'll kind of let the rest of this information, you'll see how it fits in that process. Power unit 1, let's say from Mexico City up to Nuevo Laredo. Power unit 2, moving the cargo from Nuevo Laredo to the Laredo side. You'll hear them often called as a drayage company. Power unit 3, taking your cargo from a yard in Laredo to final destination somewhere in the United States. So with that, on the northbound side, obviously the documentation process is very much the same as it is for any other import. The supplier needs to provide commercial invoice, packing list, if there's any PGAs. Is the item qualified for NAFTA? Obviously, NAFTA is big in the news right now. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later. But from a documentation standpoint, really nothing different, right? A couple of different pieces even here, though, as that cargo is en route to the Nuevo Laredo port or any Mexican border town, is that Mexico requires an actual export entry or an export pedimento. It's similar for those of you who export out of the United States to the AES filing, the EEI filing, something along those lines. But it is a customs entry process, which means a Mexican customs broker is required. The amount of liability is not near as much on the northbound side for the Mexican broker, so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about southbound. Obviously, the trucking information it's no different than if you're moving cargo from Kansas City to St. Louis here in the U.S. So I did see a question pop up real quick. Someone asked what PGA stood for. PGA is the participating government agencies. Used to be called other government agencies, things like FDA, USDA, you have ATF, Fish and Wildlife, things like that. Mexico has similar type items on their side as well. So not only are you dealing with the U.S. government agencies, you're also dealing with the Mexican ones such as SAGARPA, which would be similar to our USDA. So prior to the border crossing, you will actually get the SCAT code of that border crossing agent will be provided to your U.S. broker. We will do a U.S. customs clearance. We will do on the Mexican side. We will also do the pedimento, and then you have what's called the COVE transmitted. The COVE, in simple terms, is basically an electronic copy of the commercial invoice sent to customs. So, go ahead, Samuel.
Yeah, sorry. Just to interrupt a little bit, just to cover, it's the electronic transmission for the commercial invoice that we provide the information directly into the Mexican government, which is the Mexican SAT. Go ahead.
Correct. Okay. So once that information is transmitted, we actually have the drayage piece or the border crossing itself. A lot of you maybe don't realize a lot of your cargo that gets imported into the United States, customs agent never sees the conveyance. They don't see the cargo coming north or south across the southern border. Every truck goes through a customs agent. So every truck goes through a booth and goes through that customs agent's booth itself, which is something that's a little bit more unique than, let's say, ocean freight or air freight coming into the U.S. Obviously, like we said, we have delivery to the U.S. terminal and then the final delivery out. A couple of points to note on the U.S. side, obviously, you need to have a power of attorney in place with your U.S. broker. On the Mexican side, you need to have your Mexican customer needs to have a power of attorney, or your Mexican shipper needs to have a power of attorney in place with the Mexican broker. So real quick, here's some of that documentation that's required. You have the written authorization confirming that the broker can be the Mexican broker on the northbound, the Mexican POA. This is where it gets a little bit more intense. Mexico's articles of incorporation, the company's registration with SAT. Mexico's SAT is very similar to our IRS. It's the same type thing, but there's a lot of information that here in the U.S. that we don't file, but in Mexico, about anything that we do from a customs perspective, not only does it bounce through customs, a lot of it goes through the SAT as well. Tax ID, and then additional information, which is the power of attorney granted to the company's legal representative, and things like that. So you'll see here there's a lot more paperwork involved with setting up a Mexican customs broker rather than setting up a U.S. broker. Here in the U.S., we get a power of attorney. We do a couple of steps to vet to make sure that you are who you say you are, and then after that, we accept that and we go ahead and move forward. Mexico requires a lot more information, and we can kind of talk about why that is now. There's a question that relates to this as well, and it's that in the United States, the onus, the compliance risk falls on the importer of record. In Mexico, that is not the case. In Mexico, that compliance risk falls on the broker themselves. So that's something that's very different than what we get here in the U.S., and that's why you see a lot more information being required. That's why when we start talking about southbound, There's some comments of sometimes my cargo takes a long time to cross the border. Why does my cargo get unloaded from a truck? And there's a lot of that. And this is the main reason why. So as we get there, we can talk a little bit more about that. And Samuel can add some information as well from the Mexican customs perspective and kind of what that looks like. We also have this slide in Spanish. So if there's any questions or you would like to send this out to any of your shippers, feel free that you can send this as well. I did notice someone asked a question just a moment ago about will they get a copy of this? Yes, you will get a copy of this presentation. So we did a quick talk, U.S. importer, what information needs to be provided to the broker. Obviously the same stuff as if you have air freight or ocean freight, the same basic information. So northbound is not overly complicated. The process goes pretty quick. We don't run into the inspection process like we do on the southbound side. So cargo moving northbound across the border shouldn't feel or seem much different than your cargo that comes from Asia or Europe or Canada where cargo moves in. The only big difference on that northbound side is that there is an actual Mexican pedimento filed. From a timing perspective, shouldn't slow you down any unless your shipper is not set up with any specific broker, and we can kind of talk about that in a minute. So we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the southbound side. The southbound side is much more complicated, but it is still just simply customs business. So let's talk a little bit about some of this. So on the first side, so step one, know our Incoterms. How are we selling this cargo? A lot of cargo gets sold FCA Laredo. You might see FOB, even though FOB is a marine term. It does get misused. You also see some DAP work where maybe you're not going to take care of the customs work. Samuel's going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Also on this side is that the importer in Mexico is the one who is going to clear customs. Here in the US and Canada, we have things like non-resident importers. Those do not exist in Mexico, which if they did, I know would make a lot of your lives much easier, ours too. So once you figure out how you're selling this cargo, is your importer allowed to import the items? Do they have a broker? And that's a really big question because it can take, as you see here, up to 7 days to get set up. Because actually when you provide that power of attorney to the broker, you're actually also providing that power of attorney to SAT and to customs and saying, hey, this person is now allowed to file these on my behalf. And as any of you know, dealing with any government agency, they don't quite move at the same pace as private industry. So things can take longer. Sometimes they get a little bit more nitpicky with the certain things other than if you were dealing with just a broker, we wouldn't get that way. From a documentation perspective, we're still back down to that same set of documents. So we get a lot of questions on, well, do I still need a commercial invoice? Do I still need? Yes, the documentation that you need to clear customs in the United States is pretty much the same documentation you need to clear customs in any country, let alone Mexico, but we can go China, Germany, Brazil. So as we go through this, remember, anytime you think that, well, what documents do you normally produce? Those are the same ones. Obviously, NAFTA information gets a little bit different. And does your product actually qualify or not? So, sorry, we have a lot of questions come in. I needed to move them for a second. So once we know that your Mexican broker is set up, once we know that your Mexican importer has that broker, we're ready to ship goods to the border. I say that because with that time, what we do is we see a lot of people ship cargo early, and then it ends up getting stuck at someone's warehouse or a trucking terminal for a long time. That can cause additional storage, it can cause damage, it can cause lost freight. So make sure that you have some of this information done on the front end. So, once we have all of this done. This is before the product's already shipped, right? We need to know what our documents are, what our Incoterms are, and then is our potential customer in Mexico, are they set up to be an importer? And do they have a broker in place? And if the answer is no to either one of those questions, don't ship the cargo.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a lot more steps that we need to take to make sure that they can get cargo into Mexico, or else we're going to get stuck again. We do have a question on what is that whole setting up process. I'll let Samuel go into that here in a second once we kind of finish up the process side of this, so you guys can get a little bit more in depth into what that process looks like. So from there, so let's say all of this happens, cargo basically makes it to Laredo. So let's say it makes it to Scarborough International in Laredo, Texas, right? It makes it to my warehouse down there. So what happens next? I always kind of joke that sometimes Laredo feels like the black hole of freight, right? You ship freight down there, it goes to Laredo, and you have no idea what's going to happen next. So what is going on at that process is that because the Mexican broker takes on the liability, is we're going to take that stuff off of the truck. Now, not in all instances, but let's just go with the norm here. We're going to take that cargo off the truck. We're going to inspect that cargo. We're going to make sure that if you said you sent 100 pieces, that we have 100 pieces or 100 boxes that are getting ready to go. Because unlike in the US where you're innocent until proven guilty, in Mexico it's somewhat flip-flopped and you are guilty until proven innocent. So we do a lot of checking on the front end to make sure that that cargo crosses and we don't run into issues should that cargo go up for exam or something along those lines. Once we have gone through that process, a few things to do to help out your broker. If you have tariff numbers, add them. Any item that's going to Mexico that has identifying features on it, such as serial numbers, add those to your commercial invoice or your packing list. That's a big deal because we have to report those. So if you ship down, 100 computers and they all have serial numbers on them, if you don't tell me, you're going to pay for someone to go look and find each serial number that comes off those items. Mexico wants to know so they can identify unique items. So that's a big deal, and it's something that can really help out your broker and keep your costs down if you're willing and able to provide that kind of information, to the broker at the border, so they can go through this preview process and making sure that your cargo is what you say it is. I know that sounds like we don't trust you, and some of this is, we run into the issue where someone says I ship 100, they ship me 90. I can't file that with customs, or I take on a penalty and I take on a fine, not you. So that's where we really get into how difficult it can be to cross the border and why you need somebody that knows what they're doing with your cargo headed down that direction.
Right. In addition there, just to complement the information, the very good information that Adam is explaining us, is that in case that we send something that not match with the documentation that we prepare for the Mexican customs entry, we can be could be potential seized the part that we did not declare from the merchandise from the importation. So we need to take care, or need to be very careful about what quantity we are sending in order to avoid that seizing from Mexican customs, and in order to be able to penalties, because in Mexico any fine is mostly high, 1,000 or something like that or above. Just a few penalties are cheap, right? But so we're taking care of all the shippers and merchandise and importer records in order to support the compliance process.
Right. So, once that cargo is there, we've gone through those checks. We make sure we know what we're sending in. That's when we're going to assign a drayage company to cross that product. That's when, assuming the product is valued at more than $2,500 per Schedule B, that we're going to go ahead and file the AES transaction. That's also when a lot of the pedimento work from a data entry perspective is being entered, and you your importer is being provided previews of that, because unlike in the US, Mexican customs brokers don't front customs duty. The customs duties and taxes are actually deposited to the broker prior to a pedimento ever being filed and your cargo crossing into Mexico. Once again, we transmit the COBE here as well. It kind of goes back to that original conversation about how everything that happens down there goes through the government. That includes all payments. So if I send a bill to somebody, I actually also send that bill to the IRS. And when they pay me for our services, not only do they pay me, they let the government know that they're paying me the amount and how they're doing it. So once we kind of get through that booth, we get through the export lot on the US side, we cross into Mexico. Hopefully we go green light, which means no exam. That cargo will then transit over to someone's terminal there in Nuevo Laredo or another Mexican border town. And from there, we'll then continue on to final destination. So with that, that's kind of in a nutshell. I know we went kind of quick through that because we want to spend a lot of time going through a lot of the questions and specific instances that you guys have here. We have the same, we have an Incoterms chart here that you can walk through as we get going, what information needs to be provided. A couple of notes here, something specific to the export side. If you are only responsible to get this cargo to Laredo, and from there on out, it is a routed transaction, you don't need to provide, and I would highly recommend not providing an actual SLI. That brings on some additional liability to you guys. If you have extra questions about that, please ask them. We'll take them offline from this because I want to keep this focus just on the Mexico process, but it is more of just a public service announcement. Just be careful with providing SLIs in an instance where you aren't the one that's going to be responsible for that AES transaction. Here's some additional information about, once again, how to get it set up. Our customs brokers, who she is, her license number or her patente. That information is very important. Your customers will want to know that kind of information. Who is it? Do they have a good record with Mexican customs? And so there's our information. Once again, we have it in Spanish as well. So with that, I tried to keep it. Looks like we did just a couple of minutes over on our 20-minute goal there. We're going to start going through these questions. We have a lot of questions. So Samuel, the first question here is, will you kind of walk us through getting set up as a broker? So what does that look like from the Mexican process? I can pull up the slide here a little bit, but if you could talk a little bit more about, what information do we need? What are some of the steps that we see people take that make this process go quickly? And then sometimes what kind of holds up this process from getting done?
Sure, of course. So basically, there is two types of registration, or setup for for Mexican imports or export. Talking about northbound shipments, it's going from Mexico into the U.S., export pedimento. Southbound is going into Mexico, import pedimento. So basically, there, as Adam mentioned, only the Mexican entities can be allowed to make a formal registration with Mexican customs to be able to export or import. So then, once that they have that registration, there need to, the importer of records, once that they are, or exporter of records, once that they are already set up and approved for making import and export, they need to provide this information to the broker. So the differences between northbound, when you require a northbound shipment in Mexico, or southbound, is literally the same with one main exception. In the southbound shipments going into Mexico, all the list of documentation need to be provided, as you can see there, but the electronic power of attorney need to be, for southbound, need to be filled electronically with SAT, which means that we need to link their Mexican importer or importer of record tax ID with our Mexican broker license. And then that process is that take, as Adam mentioned, could take 4 to 7 days to be completed and need to be submitted electronically in a web portal of Mexican customs. Then need to be provide all the rest of documentation, tax ID, reading power of attorney, a copy of companies granted articles, legal representative IDs, permits, any other. So all that need to be sent by PDF, by email, and usually the customs require to us receive the power of attorney in original. You know, we can receive a copy, but it's highly recommended that the importer of record sign in original to keep in our records all these kind of documents. This is mandatory for law. For the Northbound is exactly the same. However, the electronic link for the power of attorney is not necessarily, it's just the reading. For Northbound, for Southbound need to be registered. But these need to take care for the importer of record and send them to the Mexican customs broker in order to be able to complete the legal file and be able to import or export.
Thank you. Another question here is, when we ship cargo into Mexico and it's on wooden pallets, do those pallets, are they required to be ISPM 15 compliant?
That's correct. It's a mandatory for for import into Mexico, and for Northbound shipments, same thing. Is both sides need to be certified by that international certification. It's a stamp, need to be coming stamp, which means that can be fumigated and all the international requirements to be able to cross the border, these wood pallets. Perfect.
So we talked a little bit about that border crossing process and how a lot of times there's 3 power units. In some instances, that's not necessarily the case, and maybe there's only 2 power units. So do you want to kind of talk about some of the differences of when, you know, maybe cargo stops at our place in Laredo, we use a drayage company to cross it, and then it moves to another yard, and then eventually down to the final destination, and why sometimes it only takes 2 power units and not 3?
So, okay, yes. Sorry, just quick question. When you say power units, can you clarify that? Yes.
The actual truck that's moving the trailer back and forth.
Correct. Yes. So basically, we need to use the truck for the international border crossing. So 99% of the times, it will be required, because sometimes a power unit, the main power unit, can be authorized to cross into Mexico with a lot of requirements, even including a insurance and authorization from the Mexican DOT. So in other words, we can say 100% of the time need to be cut it, you know, the original truck, and use a dryage truck to cross the international border crossing in both sides. And so if we left, for example, the cargo in a different carrier terminal in the US, the dryage, the international border crossing dryage of the truck, it's able to pick it up that and just take the Mexican entry and process the Mexican pedimento. In the case for Mexico into the US, northbound shipments, usually that is the process. The shipment arrived to the Mexican carrier terminal, and sometimes a dryage truck is going to pick it up there with the Mexican pedimento, export pedimento ready, and able then to cross into the US. When it's in the US side, into Mexico, it's going southbound, it's necessarily arrived to the warehouse, to the customs broker warehouse, to make the inspection you already spoke, in order to revise the merchandise and be able to cross. I don't know if the question was answered or.
Perfect. So a couple of questions or comments real quick on my comment about the SLI. I am referring to an SLI that has additional verbiage about it becoming a one-time power of attorney in order for someone to file the AES transaction on your behalf. As the USPPI, we have information about, there are 11 data elements that USPPI is still required to follow or to provide to whoever the agent is that's going to be filing on behalf of the foreign party. So you still have to provide that information, but you should not provide that one-time power of attorney because you aren't the one that's selecting. And basically, when you provide that one-time power of attorney, you are obligating yourself, but you have no control over that service provider and who's filing what on your behalf. So I just wanted to answer that. We got a lot of questions about that. So Samuel, will you talk a little bit more about, one more comment is that comment about routed transaction is for all countries, not just Mexico. Will you talk a little bit more about the COVE and what that is?
Sure. Originally, before 2-3 years ago, regarding the process for capture the Mexican entry, even for northbound or southbound, is literally we take the commercial invoice and putting all the information that we declare directly into Pedimento. So right now, as custom is it's a part of the Department of Treasury in Mexico. The IRS is a government office that is pretty equal, and they are as well under the Secretary of the Treasury Department in Mexico. In other words, Customs and IRS in Mexico, they are sisters offices, governments offices, and work very, very, very together in order to customs or in order to IRS processes. So around 2 years or 3 years ago, so they're created, in addition to we capture the information of commercial invoice in our Mexican entry, they require we capture the electronic a capture for the commercial invoice. The name is COVE. It's a comprobante de valor electrónico, which means in English, it's an electronic commercial invoice for customs processes, import or export. So they're trying to link all the information from the IRS declaration, taxes, federal taxes, VAT, taxes in Mexico, very related with IRS. They're trying to link and compare or match the same information you're putting in your Mexican entry for import or for export. So basically, it's a small program in the Mexican web portal where we keying all the information from the transaction and the value for the commercial invoice. Same information that we declare for IRS, which is linked in the COVE, will be exactly the same for customs purposes in a Mexican entry for import or export. It is an electronic declaration for the commercial invoice or the commercial transaction.
Thank you. So we're getting a few questions here. Both have been sent in and a few. To talk a little bit about like the courier process, right? UPS shipments, FedEx shipments. Can you just talk a little bit about those? Like, is there a value limit? Is there a weight limit? Is there something that says, okay, yeah, this makes sense to send it UPS or FedEx? And kind of, do they still need a broker? How does that process work in comparison to, okay, maybe I have 3 or 4 boxes, I still need to get them down there. What does that process look like?
Right. Yes. That kind of companies, they use a customs broker as well. So all the courier companies, there for sure need to use a customs broker in order to clear customs, even for northbound or southbound. So it is a limit. The weight and the dimension, it's on their courier a policies, right? FedEx, UPS, whatever. However, the limit on the value, it's under customs regulations. So I can confirm by reading, by email exactly what is the limit on that. But some limits are between $50. I think it's even for 300. I need to confirm that. But that it's the limit for some kind of items. Other items like a commercial, and if it's above that the limit for considering courier, they're going to import and export for the same companies, but not in division of packaging. They are under division for LTL, and they are able to clear for sure, but there need to be all the processes like a formal processes like import through a registered importer record in Mexico or exporter record. But if you are planning to send some packaging shipments by a courier, they use a custom record, and there is a limit on the value. They have a different divisions, but it is the same process that if you use a regular customs broker. Okay, for a customs perspective, for the freight, well, that is depend on the of course on the courier, UPS, FedEx, or something. But for customs, they're using a customs broker.
Okay, good to know. Do you have any update on, there are some highways, some routes where there is high crime in Mexico. Are there certain routes right now that there's more crime than other routes? Are there routes that seem to be that are safer? Are there routes that are generally safe? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The routes are general safe. The main route for into Mexico, the more straight and the more a transit, or a lot of transit in that is from Nuevo Laredo into Mexico City. So it's the shortest route. And then we have as well next to us another borders, from that the merge, for example, Legal Pass, Piedras Negras, and then sometimes another routes from El Paso and Chihuahua. Usually, all that routes merge in the same at one point in around Monterrey, San Luis, and Saltillo. It's just 4 or 5 hours to the border. That streets or that routes merge in one, but they are usually very safe routes. The only roads that we are not recommend to use or could be even a little bit more able to, or probably to any assault or something, it's just in the coast from Michoacan, Guerrero. It's totally more than the half of the country going into the west, in the west coast, but not in the big cities. For example, I'm talking about Michoacan, the state of Michoacan. They have Morelia, which is the state, and many other big cities there near Uruapan and many others. They are pretty safe. The unsafe is in the mountains. It's totally in the mountains, with it's a farm roads. It's very away from the capital. So that could be the worst, or unsafe, areas. In the border, Reynosa and McAllen. Reynosa is the next site into McAllen. Was a little unsafe, but it is not necessarily as the TV shows. It's more occasional, You need to take care of that, but during the day, it's just a normal city, The unsafe routes are more in the south, but south, as I mentioned, in the mountains inside, not in the capitals. Most, the country.
Thank you. Question here, because the pallet crate, needs to be the ISPM 15. Someone asks, does the timber product inspection certificate need to be sent with each shipment? The answer to that is no. That's the point of the stamp as well. So, as long as the stamp is visible and can be seen, it shouldn't be an issue. The visible is a big deal. We have had shipments get taken for inspection, and maybe the pallet was marked underneath for some reason and not on a side where it was easily visible. Customs actually sent that product back. They wanted nothing to do with it, and then we had to show them, well, no, the stamp was on the bottom. And it caused a lot of extra costs and delays for something that really is very simple. Just put that stamp in an area where someone can actually see it. You have to assume that your cargo has to go into Mexico, and someone's going to want to look to make sure it is on a certified pallet. A question is do we certify wooden pallets? So the answer to that is no, we don't certify them. We would just transload your product off of a non-certified pallet onto a certified pallet. So what would you say, here's the question is, what are the 3 to 5 main suggestions you would give to a company that is just starting to export into Mexico? So the 3 to 5 kind of main keys to avoid problems and headaches down the road.
First thing, it's be sure or ensure that your client in Mexico it's already registered as importer record, and they are able to provide you the confirmation to use the broker that you as a shipper, as a US shipper, choose. So use a good US Mexican and US broker, but ensure that your customer says, okay, I'm going to be on charge of the cost of the shipment. So, but just confirm me that you're going to register and going to be a custom setup to use our broker. So this is the first thing. Need to be registered in a customs, need to be able to provide all the information that we spoke to the customs broker that you choose if you are in charge of all the costs. That is the first thing to need to revise before send the cargo into Mexico. The other 2-3 main things are revise your merchandise in order to, if you're going to send in a pallet, for example, trying to send the same kind of item as much as possible per pallet. If you're going to send a lot of stuff, just trying to create pallet very easily to inspect. They're going to save a lot of time and a lot of liability for everyone in Mexico. So if you send everything mixed, we're going to break all the pallet and revise in a very, very detailed way. And that is something going to take more time and could be more expensive for everyone. So send the information in advance in order to try to we as a broker determine the correct HTS code, because everything's going to determine by the HTS code. Permits, other government permits, or partners, government office permits, the duties, the exemption, and everything. So send the information about packing list, commercial invoice or something. Even an email with, I'm trying to send all these kind of products. Can you tell me, I don't know, what's the suggested HTS code in advance? That helps a lot as well. And other than that, I think is the main things, that you can consider in order to save time and cost for the southbound shipments.
Thank you. We talked a little bit earlier about the required documentation, and we talked that says, documentation into Mexico is really no different than documentation into any other country. And someone asked, is that some of our customers require us to include, a billing invoice, commercial invoice, packing list, and others just request the commercial invoice. Why is that? And my answer to that is, that is really between you and your customer more so than you and the broker. As a broker, I would love to get I need the commercial invoice so I can go through my process. I would love to have a packing list as well. But other than that, I can do my job with just that limited information. If you want to provide additional information, there's nothing wrong with that. And we always appreciate additional info. But at the end of the day, I need commercial invoice packing lists. So as Samuel explained, we can go through, we can classify the goods, and kind of work our way through that process to keep our liability as low as possible. Another question here is, Samuel, is that let's talk a little bit about the DAP DDP scenario, right? Overall, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is that, and we talked about it earlier, where you cannot be a non-resident importer, which makes DDP very difficult. Correct. And so technically, you cannot ship DDP into Mexico because you can't be the importer of record. However, Samuel's going to kind of explain to you the way that some companies actually do ship DDP, but it's just a little bit of a different scenario that's provided. So do you want to kind of walk through that a little bit, Samuel?
Sure, of course. As you mentioned, DDP, it's a complex scenario to use for the U.S. shipper. However, is one very good reason and very good point to use that if have the opportunity to make the right agreements with import of records. When as DDP, as only Mexican entities are able to import, when you are the shipper and you send the goods into Mexico, so you have the options to use the DDP, absorbing all the charge for the fees and for the services, and putting sell all your merchandise when absorbing all the costs for processing or forwarding and even the duty sometimes. So the thing for you is that you need to make an agreement with importer record and say, hey guys, I'm going to sell in you. I'm going to DDP and I'm going to absorb or be responsible for all the processes and the charges in the United States using my Mexican customs broker. So to be able to that happen, the importer record need to register our broker license and just borrow us, or borrow you the importer record registration, and we can be able to clear the customs with through our broker license and everything, and charge all or bill all the charges and all the fees to the U.S. shipper. However, the main thing that is very helpful with the frequent volume. When you send them into Mexico, a frequent volume or permanent volume of shipments every week, every 2 weeks or daily. So you have the options to use that, because as you can choose one Mexican broker, you are ensuring that your compliance in your goods, the compliance in your regulations, the determination on the HTS code and everything is going to be taken care very well, and will be very smooth, the process to send the shipments into Mexico. So in other words, when you sell that, for example, you can sell with all that charge included, stating to your customer, you know what, my price is this one, and I'm going to absorb all the loading, unloading, forwarding, inspection, customs, shipper export, all the costs in order to you can receive the merchandise free of charge. So, however, the import will be, again, under the importer records, and the duties is just different kind of duties that can apply. All the processing fees, the Mexican VAT, which is the IVA, and the international duties, the commerce of duties, so ad valorem. So basically, just the VAT. Most of the time, when you use NAFTA, you avoid the processing fee, you are avoiding the international duties, and just apply in a permanent or consumption imports is just apply the VAT. In the VAT, we can explain in more detail by email, but you have two options. If the importer of record absorbs the VAT, it's refundable for them. If the US shipper absorbs the VAT, need to make an internal agreement, because the importer of records always can be asked for refund the Mexican VAT duties. So that is a little bit more detail that we can provide by email in a direct question for that. But the good news on this is that using a DDP, you're going to avoid a third parties companies as a third party as a custom broker for your importer record, and where you will be not ensuring that they're going to cross on time, make the right processes, compliance all the Mexican regulation, which is an issue. And what could be the risk for the US shipper in that? Delays, time, cost, and in the worst of the cases, lose the merchandise for some custom season in case that a permit was not complied, or in case that they are wrong HTS code. So that is something very important to need to consider, because just as a general information for you guys, U.S. Customs broker, it's the main goal of that is a national security agency. Mexican Customs is not a national security agency. Their main goal is a revenue government office. That is the reason, because the penalty is very straight. I'm very firm on that. So two different way of entry the goods into the United States: safety, national security one, and revenue and capture duties and taxes and duties. So in other words, Mexican Customs it's taking revenue instead of national security. It's a treasure of government office.
Right. And so, the question comes up is, why would the importer let us do that? Well, it's because in Mexico, the importer's liability is very, very, very low, and the broker's is very, very, very high. So, a lot of it comes down to the EVA and how we want to work through that. Will you take a minute and kind of talk about that 16% EVA? Because there's always a lot of questions on that, and they're like, well, my goods are duty free. Why is there still 16%? And so people don't understand that. So will you talk about the EVA for a few minutes?
Sure, of course. And so when you purchase some goods in the United States or in another country like Canada, you pay your value of the goods, and they apply the EVA, correct? They apply the tax. I mean, it's $5 plus tax. Everything have a tax in the goods, whatever goods that you're purchased. In Mexico, when you purchase a good in Mexico, the tax is already included, okay? Which we call EVA, right? It is already included. If you purchase some television or some food or whatever, everything is got the final price. It's 50 pesos, $5, whatever they equal. It's the EVA. It's coming inside, so it's coming already with the final purchase. It's not separate. So when you import something into Mexico, any goods, that is the reason, because we apply the VAT, the EVA, the 16% of EVA in Mexico, because if they have the good in Mexico, they need to pay, of course, as a mandatory, the Mexican tax in order to be able to commercialize that, to sales that, because they're not allowed to adding the EVA at the time that they're making any transaction for goods, in this case for goods. So that is the reason, because you're paying your VAT at the time that import. So the price at the end need to be included, and that's in an import need to be included at the time that the merchandise cross the border and enter into Mexico. So however, that EVA, that VAT as well, through IRS processes or IRS taxes and regulations, once that you get it, your reporter of record in Mexico are able to deduct that payment versus the VAT that they need to pay for other kind of good or services. I don't know if the answer was the question was a little bit clearer answer.
Yeah, so is that even if the item is $100 and there is no duties on it, there is still 16% EVA that gets paid on that item. So there's still $16 worth of tax.
That's correct.
So that is where I think we get a lot of people get confused because they're like, oh, my item's duty free, and then they see a tax fee on their invoice and they don't understand what those taxes are for. And it's the same as the Europe value added tax type scenario. We deal with this as a service provider as well. If Scarborough de Mexico does the work and sends a bill in Mexico, we have to add that 16% EVA. If Scarborough International does the work in Laredo, such as the warehouse work or any of the preview work, and then we bill that directly to someone in Mexico, we end up not adding the EVA. So there are some ways to get around some of that 16% or keep that EVA lower. But at the end of the day, it's simply a sales tax, no different than when you go and you buy something at the store here in the U.S., you pay sales tax on it.
Right, and in this case, I'm just clarifying that because when it's good, the IVA or the VAT, it is already included, which means it need to be paid at the time of the imports to be. For service, we add in the IVA is just depending if you require a legal invoice. We call factura from IRS services or perspective. When you require a service from a formal company, they're telling, did you require your invoice? Yes, I need to apply 16% of IVA, of VAT. Right. On services. And service, it's always separate. On goods, not. That is the reason because we need to pay at the time. So remember, IVA is not an international duty. That is the reason because when we said it is duty-free, yes, for international duties, but all the imports into Mexico, permanent need to pay IVA, and the IVA can be refundable by government asking by at the time of the tax declaration by the importer of records.
Another question here is, I'm going to give you a quick scenario here, and this is probably one of the last questions. We only have a couple of minutes left here, is that I've hired a salesman in Mexico City. I'm going to be shipping equipment from the U.S. down to that salesman in Mexico City. Can that salesman act as the importer? Does every customer that we send to need to have their own broker? What are some of the options in that scenario? Let's say we exclude the DDP option, but what are some of those options that, can that one salesman act as the importer that then turn around and sell those goods? Or would each customer down in Mexico need their own broker?
Well, so the scenario is going to send something to Mexico or it's already.
So I've hired you to work for me in Mexico City. I send equipment to you to try to sell.
Okay. It's in a consignee. Okay.
Right. So, and then you as the salesperson go out, you go door to door and you try to sell whatever the widget is that I've sent you to go sell. Mm-hmm. In that scenario, can you as that salesman act as the importer, or does the customer, when we send the goods to the customer, need to be the one to act as the importer?
That is the customer. The final customer need to be act as importer of record because I'm as a salesman, I'm not able to act as importer of record. I can sometimes a non-companies, a physical person, a person can ask for be an importer of record, but there need to have some business like a DBA, doing business as. So that is an option. Also, a few times customs approve, be importer of record. However, it's non-recommended to use a single person or a DBA person as importer record because it's the government, they don't like it, the Mexican government, they don't like it to that scenarios, and many of the broker cancellations coming through imports that DBAs. Sometimes they are approved at least a few times because you need to be a person that doing business as a corporation, but you don't have a properly a corporation, right? So it's just depend on that. But the way that salesman, it's not a scenario that can be able to import a record. Need to be someone that doing business like one DBA, right? And with a strong record in the transactions, you know. So in other words, need to be the importer record company, established company at the final client, you know, that purchased the goods.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, we're out of time. So a couple of housekeeping notes. This presentation will get sent out to everyone who has registered. If you haven't registered, or I guess you all have, but if you know people who haven't, this will also get posted on Scarborough's YouTube channel. So please go take a look at that. Feel free to forward that out. This entire presentation will be out there probably, hopefully by the end of this week. Those of you who have questions that were asked anonymously, if you would respond once that email goes out, if you would respond to that email if we didn't get to your question and ask your question again, because we don't necessarily know who asked that, so we can't get an answer back to you. So if you would respond to that email, ask your question again, we'll be happy to get you the answer back. So with that, thank you, Samuel, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, of course. See you here. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.